Alright, word saying, video going, words, and here's video start. So, here's a video, Fire Pro. So, I've been saying I'm gonna put a video together for a while. You know, it's been a while since I played this game. And I started exercising a few months ago, and I would say probably when I started exercising, this game kind of fell down in the prioritizing. Though I was putting together how I can make a routine out of making videos, and it's a video game. It's about pro wrestling, but going beyond both of those, I think it would appeal. Of course, it would appeal to video. I'm trying to make videos that spark some interest in people and who share their thoughts and feelings, and that's the whole thing at the end of it. For me, I think, is connection. I was really inspired by a video that I saw made by Chris, who I had a really good conversation with. I want to share that. And I'm sitting here in my car. I just went on a hike, and I decided to grab the computer and the controllers and go ahead and bring it along with me, and just to get a video down. And even when I say just get it down, it's not a practice thing. None of the videos are practice. Every single video that I do is the final product, whether and I don't think of like a rating system. This is out of enjoyment and hopefully and connection. And if people find enjoyment or some way to connect, and when I say connection, it's connection to myself. I connect to myself through the medium of Fire Pro, through the medium of pro wrestling history. So I use Fire Pro to express myself with wrestling history as a platform. I don't want to get too psychological into it. I did want to express my thoughts, and a few minutes have gone by already. Almost 3 minutes have gone by, and I've spoken this entire time, and I'm the only person that's gonna speak this time. Maybe the next video it will be somebody else. I'm not really talking about the screen a ton, just more thoughts that come to my mind, but the screen is part of it. Like this people you see on the screen. So the character you see is Johnny Valentine. He just raised his hands. People who know wrestling history might say, well, why is his hair brown? So he's actually in his gimmick of Cowboy Rocky Valentine from the mid-50s. He was brought into Los Angeles the wrestling promotion office in Los Angeles to be a cowboy. And so he didn't bleach his hair. His hair was brown. He's Cowboy Rocky Valentine. I was doing a video. I'm still in the midst of trying to edit this video with him as Cowboy Rocky Valentine. Hopefully I get that done one of these days. So he's still dressed as Cowboy Rocky Valentine. And Johnny Valentine is the foundation of Fire Pro psychology. That's what I call my channel. The theme of my channel is like the psychological side of wrestling and wrestling history, and this video game to express wrestling history. It's psychological, and I think that's the part that interests me. And all my interests in video game comes and goes, and even wrestling and wrestling history come and go. And probably like a lot of us, I don't stick to it 24/7 per se. I implement it to the amount that it allows me to have enjoyment. I try not to overdo it so I tire of it, but I also don't think of it in terms of like, I need to do this or compel myself to do this or force myself to do this. I think for a couple of reasons. One, I don't want to ruin it for myself by overdoing it. And two, uh, there's not a ton of interest or any interest out there in the videos that I do per se yet, if ever. It's not to say that there will be or won't be. I would love to inspire people to learn of wrestling psychology and wrestling history, and utilize Fire Pro in the exploration of both of those, but even utilize Fire Pro and wrestling history and wrestling psychology in the exploration of humanity, of ourselves, of others, how we interact with people. Pro wrestling itself is weird. It's an interesting phenomenon. It's unique. I think you could say that about any sport or any pastime. There's a uniqueness, particularly if somebody's dedicated any amount of time to it. There's a uniqueness to it that you can learn about and express your own interest in learning about. So over the bulk of my life, this has been one of the primary interests, and you could say from one perspective, you could say it's a colossal waste of time. From another perspective, it's a way to pass the time enjoyably, or not, or just to feel connection with ourselves, with others, with, the psychology behind it. I don't know. It's something, and significant enough for me to consider making videos about. So the other person in the ring here is thesz, and I think I may do something that controls him here. And they're in a gym setting, so this would sort of like be a practice. Johnny Valentine is known as one of the toughest and greatest ring psychologists in the history of wrestling. And it's not to say he's either of those, but I think, at the same time, thesz is considered the greatest pro wrestler in wrestling history in a lot of ways. And that's not to say that that's even true. What is wrestling? What's pro wrestling? What's wrestling? I know Lou, during his lifetime, he associated a lot with mat wrestling and amateur wrestling to an extent. During his prime, I think pro wrestling was closer to mat wrestling. It was still a spectacle, and that may be a nice way to say it was a performance, a version of theater that takes place in a wrestling ring. So the dramaturgy. I don't know. And to assign a value judgment to I have no idea. So a lot of this stuff that I share, it will have a historical orientation to it, but at the same time, I'm a fan. These wrestlers were active before I was even a fan. I didn't know who Lou Thesz was until a few years after he wrestled his last match at 74. But Lou became a way to learn about wrestling history and to pass the time enjoyably. And later on, I learned of Johnny Valentine. They knew each other and had a respect for each other. Both of them shared in a respectful manner about each other. I learned about Johnny Valentine later, really, and then the ring psychology became of a central interest. Once you recognize that it's a non-competitive medium, then the psychology of like trying to make it look well, it's not non-competitive, I guess I would say, in the sense that, and this is, again, I'm a fan, was a fan, or however you want to term me, a non-participant in any measure beyond audience member. But to what I gather, there is a competition, but the competition is not between the participants in the ring per se, but it's the participants in the ring performing a spectacle that appears competitive, and the competition is to generate the interest of the people in the audience. And that's where the psychological part comes in. So in that sense, wrestling is every bit as competitive as any sport spectacle or any endeavor you can think of out there. And that's not a justification to say this is why you should respect wrestling or this is why wrestling is competitive. I haven't watched current wrestling, for decades, many years, we'll say at this point. So I don't think about it in those terms. And these are just thoughts that come to my mind, but Johnny Valentine is somebody that you wouldn't necessarily see in a gym. And in the 50s, which the golden age of TV wrestling, when TV first started, to my understanding, wrestling became very popular because it was easy to understand. The technology was limited in the video quality of the what they presented on TV, so wrestling was a natural, and then the business boomed in a certain way, but also fell in other ways. And Johnny Valentine was a part of that, and so was thesz, and the gentleman I have on the outside of the ring, Dick Hutton, was also a part of that to an extent. Well, Johnny Valentine being a villain or a rule breaker, you would not typically in the 50s see him at a public workout at a gym. Generally, the villains stayed away from the gym. thesz, in his biography, says the villains, or the people who didn't come to the gym, were typically, they didn't know how to wrestle, quote unquote, so they would stay away from the public workouts. But I think also probably, I imagine the villains would stay away from the gym to kind of keep that allure. So again, the psychological aspect of it. So I don't typically have Johnny Valentine in the gym when I use Fire Pro. thesz, he would have been more of a fan favorite. Not always. He would wrestle rough also, they would call it. But have those two here right now while I'm talking about it. And I put them both in there. In playing this game for years, I've probably played more matches of thesz. I would definitely have to say into the thousands, maybe. Definitely hundreds. Probably into the thousands of matches of thesz. And Johnny Valentine is a little more recent in terms of that. So yeah, you can... Johnny Valentine was known for not running the ropes. Running the ropes is as simple as going back in a bid to, in the 50s, they would do a thing where they would crisscross each other. So one guy would start running, then the other guy would start running, then they would crisscross. So it would produce some kind of drama. You'll see it in some of my matches. And then something might happen from there. So, like they ran into each other there. But we can do the crisscrossing again. Hit the ref by accident. So another aspect sort of revealed. It's a leap that Johnny Valentine wouldn't do. I don't know why I gave him that. I don't remember what I was working on to give him that per se. Psychology in wrestling, as I understand it, is, or really in anything, is nothing, is doing nothing. When you're doing nothing, you're thinking. So it's the thinking. Wrestling psychology with the audience. To do nothing but invoke a thought process in the audience, whether it's concern or excitement. I think probably in the more current wrestling, the excitement aspect, I would say, is overdone. It became overdone to the point where I just lost interest in it as a pastime, so I abandoned it. I think because there are other areas of interest, but excitement, you can consider that sort of like action movies where it's all excitement, as opposed to a movie, that's slowed down and you process your feelings, process the emotions as nothing, as even as less is happening. So there's a minimal quality to it. And I've had a couple of videos where it's said it like this, but here it's Johnny Valentine or JV and thesz stare. This is a stare down. They're not doing anything. They're standing there in the rain. It's like, and they're characters in a video game, so they're not thinking anything, but they're potentially being controlled by humans who are thinking something. They're portraying humans. They're symbols for human beings, so we can project into them and onto them and what's going through their mind. Um, they're standing uncomfortably close to each other in a sense of like violating one another's space. Now I move thesz just a bit closer, and it's like this is really close. This is like you would not be comfortable in real life, unless it's somebody you're sharing intimacy with. It would be uncomfortable. So there's a psychological tension to it. And this game has the key to it is the grappling. I don't want to make this a technical breakdown of the game per se, but the grappling is definitely a significant part of the game. And I'll trigger it right now. So they just locked up in a grapple. When you move close to your opponent, you automatically lock into a grapple. So you see they sort of wound up and then they came forward in a collar and elbow tie-up, is what they call it. So now they're grappling. So from there, they try to execute a hold or a strike using the buttons. Do that right now. I'll execute a clinching arm clinch by Johnny Valentine. So now I use that hold sort of as a way to stop the action when I play the matches. And typically a rule breaker or a rough wrestler will use it to stop a fan favorite wrestler, because the fan favorite is typically more skilled than the rough wrestler. Because if the rough wrestler, and this isn't mine, I heard this in interviews with Bill Watts, but he said the rationale is if you're the tougher wrestler has to be the fan favorite, because if he's not the fan favorite, and he shouldn't be the toughest wrestler or the best wrestler, in the sense that, like, if he's breaking the rules to get an advantage, then he's not better than the fan favorite. So I think that's an aspect of psychology that was probably lost, but more innately understood even in the 50s and back into the 30s and Strangler Lewis era. This idea that, and Bill Watts articulated it in an interview, he was a promoter and a wrestler for years, that there's no reason for a fan favorite to initiate rough wrestling with his opponent because he can rely on his skills. The villain or the rule breaker wrestler breaks rules because he can't rely on his skills, because he is being out wrestled by the fan favorite. So people will say that psychology is deteriorated or no longer relevant in wrestling today. I would imagine that's the case, and that's why I came to Fire Pro. Fire Pro allows me to sort of like flash freeze the psychology as I prefer it, which is like that very standard, plumb and level in carpentry work, and that's not my commentary. I heard that Ole Anderson say that in an interview, that he said, in carpentry, you can't tell me that plumb and level aren't still uh, relevant in carpentry. So he says pro wrestling is the same thing. I agree with that. I've never put my money behind it. I don't know that. I think the world is a different place. Does it have place for a non-competitive wrestling spectacle? I have no idea. But in the context of Fire Pro, it keeps my interest. So I'll have them grapple again. I'll have thesz bounce off the ropes twice and then charge Johnny, and then Johnny will execute an underhook arm to stop Lou. So that was kind of slow because I had to grab the controller, Johnny Valentine. And he releases it, and they're both standing. So I wish he didn't have that jump like that. Wipe the sweat off his brow there. I guess that's all I've got for now. This is almost 22 minutes worth, and I usually try to set something up when I have these videos, and I think something can be lost in trying to set stuff up. I think there's a value and a legitimacy to preparing and producing, but there's also a value in not. And again, to bring it back to wrestling and even Fire Pro Wrestling, you can, if you're playing the game, you can do things, you can set it up, or you can go off the cuff. And if you get to a certain level, you can actually just really go off the cuff. And you imagine you gain all these skills and moves and these holds, and you can utilize them in really creative ways that make it interesting. And then on top of it, to use psychology in between those, I think it can make for a really interesting spectacle. I don't know how well that can translate into a video game, particularly for people who aren't interested in video games or people who aren't interested in pro wrestling or specifically even wrestling history. There's some matches and other on my channel that I put together. Buddy Rogers versus Luther Lindsay from Cleveland. Luther Lindsay versus Pat O'Connor in Edmonton. Mr. Wrestling versus thesz in Atlanta. So those three are more example of a higher preparation and production. But at the end of the day, when I create the match, I generally don't have a pacing in mind, like a step-by-step thing in mind. There's an improvisational quality to it, and I think the legitimacy or the value or significance in the improvisational aspect of it is that there's an improvisational aspect to life. Like, we can prepare things or things to be this in that way, and maybe part of it is that I'm more comfortable in an improvisational context than I am in a preparation, in a prepared thing. Because if you can just go for it with something, it feels like there's a freedom in that. But there can also be an aspect of freedom in preparation and production and putting something together, because then you infuse a part of yourself into the performance. But And that's improvisational to an extent. You like in acting, if you're putting together, playing a scene, you're infusing your feelings into the scene, presumably, as opposed to like into the words, which the words are the structure. The words, particularly if you're professional, 9 times out of 10, they're going to give you words that you have to say, and really kind of they want the way that they want you to act, I'm assuming. So you have to find clever ways to contort yourself into the circumstance where you get to play or you feel free. And improvisation is nothing but freedom. I say that as opposed to something that's improvisational, and there's improv in acting also, to my understanding, where there's just total freedom. So you don't have to think of how, or through repetition, you know, this is the way you're going to experience a reasonable facsimile thereof, or genuine freedom within a constricted, in the confines of a structure. But because there is almost no structure, it's the entirety is freedom. So the structure here is I'm applying, you know, my thought process to Fire Pro and wrestling history, and that's it. And I come up with these circumstances that are confines, but they're large confines. So there's lots of room for improvisation, and by improvisation I just mean thoughts that come to my mind in the moment. And all of this, uh, and then imagine applying it to the actual playing of the game and the match. So I've spoken for a number of minutes. I may cut this up into multiple videos. You know, I appreciate you and your thought process, and your interest in this video. What can I say? I don't think this video doesn't hold a lot of significance outside of my own personal interest, without other people being interested in it. I'm not taking cues from a whole lot of people on the direction I should take my videos in. I am doing stuff and then putting it in people's hands to find interest in it or not. And I don't know I tried to make it more interesting in certain ways, but there are probably a lot of ways where I'm unwilling to make it interesting at the expense of, uh, you know, the ways that it makes it interesting to me. So hopefully those aren't necessarily mutually exclusive, but in a lot of ways they are, and those are separate. I like to see if I can find ways to align them, and if they can't align, then this is just more stuff out there. So anyways, long story short on that, just to say, I appreciate you, whoever's listening and watching this. I appreciate, I appreciate you. I'm saying that I appreciate the effort that you put into existence in the world. I think wrestling itself, the word wrestling means struggle itself. So, in underlying psychological terms, it never stops being that struggle. So whether you struggle with life, you're wrestling with life or circumstances, I think if you're hearing this, you exist. So there's some validity in that, and the thoughts that you come to, mainly if you're not harming people, and hopefully you're not distressing people also, or intentionally distressing people, but definitely you shouldn't be harming people. And that puts it into an even greater context. But all that to say, thank you, and forward to sharing more videos with you. Thanks so much.